It really made me think of R. Kelly when I read this indictment and I saw exactly what the allegations were. The conduct is very similar. You're talking about coercion, threats, cover-ups, and everything for the sexual gratification of the individual, in this case, Combs.
First, tell me about the severity of things when the feds, especially the Southern District of New York, arrest you.
When the Southern District takes a case, it has a specialized unit that deals with the most severe cases. Also, Southern District, 99% conviction rate. When the federal government is the one to investigate and ultimately make an arrest, they really are meticulous and they make sure that they have sufficient evidence. They cross their T's and dot their I's. And by the time you get to an indictment, the investigation is thorough and complete, which is why the conviction rate is so high.
Can you set up how this is a grand jury indictment and not just a prosecutor going after Sean Combs?
When someone's indicted, it means that a grand jury has made a determination that there's probable cause a crime was committed and that the individual being indicted is the one that committed the crime. Probable cause is the lowest level under the law. And when probable cause is found, that means an arrest can be moved forward and the case will go to trial. The grand jury process, though, is a prosecutorial process, meaning prosecutors present evidence to the grand jury. The defense does not get the opportunity to respond.
So we know Sean Combs was arrested at a hotel late last night. His attorney said they had been in New York in anticipation of the charges. What does that tell you?
Couple of things. That means that they were in communication, the defense attorney and prosecutors, regarding the impending charges and that they were going to be coming down imminently. This isn't surprising because we saw these raids play out in May. It's likely that his defense attorneys believed that this was going to come at some point. And instead of him being going down the perp walk and being dragged out of his home, there are times when you can coordinate between prosecutors and defense attorneys to give yourself up willingly. Another aspect of this, it helps with an argument about bail. It says that this person is not a flight risk and they're willing to come when they have court appearances and when it's necessary.
His attorney also made a statement before the news even broke about being disappointed with the charges and stating Sean Combs was innocent. What is your opinion on that statement?
No surprise his defense attorney is saying that Sean Combs is innocent. He conceded that he's had some problems, but ultimately he's not a criminal. Something I did notice, though, the statement really was a litany of accomplishments of Sean Combs, as opposed to really talking about the merits of the case. That's something that never really seems like a good thing because it's not focused on the actual allegations or underlying defenses. It relates to the person in general. That being said, you have to be so careful what's put out there in the public sphere when you're defending a case.
And feds have been pretty silent to this point. How is that telling?
The feds were silent to this point, but that's really the norm in a case like this. First of all, you have intense media interest on this case. Second of all, you have a high-profile person with a lot of means who could potentially flee the country, get out of town, go to a different location. And in addition to that, they are very, very strategic about collecting the evidence, taking witness statements, protecting those witnesses so their identities are not given up early on in the investigation, and moving forward with an indictment without making much of a public statement so that the indictment speaks for itself.
So tell me, what are prosecutors claiming?
Prosecutors are claiming that Combs abused, threatened, and coerced women around him for the purpose of furthering his sexual desires. He also used his employees and others close to him in his sphere to cover up his conduct and actually engage in other crimes like kidnapping, arson, and obstruction of justice.
Which is quite serious.
It's incredibly serious, and it's far broader than we anticipated when these raids began.
So what exactly is Sean Combs charged with?
Combs is charged with racketeering, sex trafficking, and sex trafficking over state lines to engage in prostitution.
And what do these specific charges tell you?
These specific charges signal a criminal enterprise. It means that Combs is not the only one involved.
Is Sean Combs like a mob boss?
Interestingly enough, the racketeering statute was actually started because it was going after those in the mob. oftentimes you couldn't get to the higher level individuals in the mob. And so the racketeering statute says that there's a criminal enterprise. Basically, he's like a mob boss.
Can you explain how this is like organized crime of the mob?
It's like organized crime because it's a meeting of the minds of various conspirators in furtherance of committing and covering up other crimes. So the allegations in this indictment relating to Combs is that he's the one that everything was in furtherance of. It was his sexual desires, covering up crimes he was committing and utilizing those around him to facilitate those crimes. That's how he really is in a criminal enterprise as far as the prosecutors are concerned.
So how long is he looking at? Should he be convicted? Is he looking at life in prison?
The most serious charges could carry life in prison. There's also an amplifier in this particular indictment, which says that he could be subject to a harsher penalty if he were to be convicted. That's typically based on a prior criminal record. Other factors that are looked at, just the nature and extent of the conduct and the amount of time that prosecutors allege he was engaging in this criminal enterprise.
I noticed there's a special sentencing factor mentioned in the indictment. Can you explain that?
The special sentencing factor means that he could face an even harsher penalty than what is under the federal guidelines as far as a sentence. It means that at the end of the trial, the judge could actually impose additional time. This could be because of a prior criminal record, or it could be because of the severity of the guilty verdict.
In terms of evidence, how big of a role do you think the Cassie Hotel video played in everything?
The Cassie Hotel video seems like it played a pivotal role in the case. And that's because in the indictment, while Cassie isn't specifically named, there are references to what we saw in that video. In fact, it seems like video evidence played a central role in the prosecution bringing this case to the courtroom.
How does this video show what Sean Combs is capable of?
This video shows that Sean Combs is capable of violent conduct. And that's a lot of what we saw in the indictment. It also is going to be a factor to his credibility. Remember, he initially denied that any of that conduct took place when he settled a civil lawsuit. Then the video became public. That really undermines whether or not we can believe anything he says, and is something the prosecutors will exploit.
What could he have to forfeit because of all of this?
Noticeably in the indictment, there's a whole section that relates to forfeiture. That means that the federal government, if he is convicted, can come in and seize property, bank accounts, anything, any of his finances, anything financial, if it was an ill-gotten gain from the criminal enterprise. So basically, all of his possessions, all of his property, all of his money, and maybe even his ownership to his song catalog could be at stake.
He and his team have long denied the charges. What do you anticipate his defense attorneys doing at this point?
Right now, keep in mind this indictment was just unsealed. So defense attorneys are now going to be engaging in what's called the discovery process. The prosecution has an obligation to turn over every piece of evidence that they have collected. The defense attorneys are then going to review it, analyze it, and set forth to have the best defense for their client at trial.
Was there anything that specifically stood out to you in the indictment?
The mention of freak-offs is used all throughout this indictment. These are allegedly elaborately produced sex parties that were allegedly recorded. Interestingly enough, it also said that sex workers were actually brought in from over state lines and in some cases internationally to participate in these. That's what makes this a federal crime.
Really explain what a big deal this is and how it factors in.
The freak-offs is a central part of this indictment, and that's because we're talking about federal charges of sex trafficking. In order for prosecutors to prove that, they have to show that something is happening over state lines, that there's coercion, that there's force of having individuals participate in these freak-offs under coercion, and also that people are moving over state lines or potentially internationally. That is something that's required in order for prosecutors to be successful for a conviction.
Can you talk about how these freak-offs basically sound like R. Kelly on steroids?
It really made me think of R. Kelly when I read this indictment and I saw exactly what the allegations were. The conduct is very similar. You're talking about coercion, threats, cover-ups, and everything for the sexual gratification of the individual, in this case, Combs. It really mirrors a lot of what we saw play out in the R. Kelly trial. With Combs, though, it's even to a higher degree than we saw with R. Kelly.
How long do prosecutors allege these freak-offs would last?
Prosecutors allege that these freak-offs sometimes lasted for days, involved multiple people, and some of the people involved were drugged, according to prosecutors.
What else did they allege Combs would do to make victims participate?
Prosecutors allege that Combs subjected the victims to physical and emotional abuse to participate in these alleged freak-offs.
They said in the press they aren't done. Tell me what that means to you.
Because there's a racketeering statute involved, that generally indicates that there's co-conspirators. We don't know whether or not the individuals that were in Combs' sphere, which are referenced, security guards, other people who are close to him, who apparently helped facilitate his conduct as well as cover it up. We don't know if they're witnesses or if they're individuals that are ultimately going to be charged in this case. It is likely that we will see more charges as this case goes on. Allegedly, victims who participated in these freak-offs were drugged. Not only that, in order to help them recover so that they could participate in one the next day and the day after that, they were given IVs against their will.
Can you talk about the claims that women had to sometimes hide for days after these alleged beatings?
The claims that women had to hide for sometimes days, by the way, first of all, incredibly disturbing. But the reason that it's relevant is that, remember, all of the conduct relates to covering up this criminal enterprise, and that Combs was a violent person. Some of the underlying conduct which make up the racketeering charge are kidnapping, abuse, arson. So there's multiple facets to this, and that is a factor that's really going to be relevant for prosecutors as the case moves forward.
Could we see future charges for any potential accomplices in these alleged crimes?
It's likely that we will see charges against accomplices because we're talking about a racketeering statute that involves conspiracy. We've also heard that others helped him cover up his conduct. So it's likely that others are involved. Whether or not they will be charged, only time will tell. But even in the indictment, there were references to other underlying state crimes. Just because this federal action is moving forward, there could be other analogous state charges as well.
Specifically his sons, could they get caught up in anything down the road?
While his sons were not charged in this indictment, and there's no indication that charges are coming at this point, we know that they were a part of the raid. We know that investigators were looking at them at the time those raids were conducted. So it's certainly possible that we could see something relating to them, whether it be charges or whether they're witnesses down the road.
What is the likelihood Sean Combs gets bail or is released today?
It's really up to the judge and within the judge's discretion. Here's what the judge takes into consideration: dangerousness, risk of flight, the fact that obstruction is a charge, and the severity of the allegations. Right now, prosecutors are saying there is no amount of bail that will be sufficient, that he should remain in custody, while defense attorneys are saying $50 million and home confinement with a device that will keep track of Combs. That's the argument before the court today.
Do we have any idea of a timeline of how long he would be kept?
Every defendant has the right to a speedy trial, but oftentimes these trials do not move forward within the 90-day parameters of the law because there's so many pretrial motions and issues in the legal world that need to be decided before you get into the courtroom. You're talking about a year to 2 years before we see a trial.